So, as we move on from the colonies, you guys got to understand that there is some tension that is brewing between the colonies. And we're going to kind of dive into that a little bit in this slide or this presentation or lecture. We're going to start discussing the American Revolution and the things that led to the American Revolution, all right? So, the first thing I think you got to start with when you're talking about the American Revolution in my brain is what I consider to be one of the main catalysts or one of the main starts to the American Revolution, and that is the Great Awakening. Okay, so the Great Awakening says religion would become less important to American colonies as trade and economic prosperity took place in the late 1600s. Salem witch trials show the many dangers of extreme religion. However, when you get to the 1730s to 1740s, America is going to experience a revival in religious fervor known as the Great Awakening. Traveling preachers would go from town to town and hold massive services in common areas. So the Great Awakening is something that a lot of people can dive really, really deep into, but I'm going to kind of simplify it for you when talking about it. The Great Awakening does one thing. Number one, or I guess it does many things, but one of the things that it does do is it's going to give the individuals in the colonies something in common. So as we talked about in the previous lectures, the three different sections of the colonies, they don't really have a whole lot in common based off the fact of what they're doing, who they're doing it with, and their interactions with the people that they are with. What this is going to do when the Great Awakening and when religion starts sweeping through the entire nation is it is going to allow people to have something in common. And this is good because when you have something in common, you have a better relationship. This is with anything in life. So it's going to give them this one thing that's going to give them something in common, but it's also going to do this. Many people, when talking about the Bible and their religion, and they were really, really, really focusing on the fact that, you had to fear God and you must be in the church to have a relationship with God. And if you don't, you would be sent to hell. And that was pretty much that. And that church was pretty strict. Well, the Great Awakening is going to provide a avenue to where you can have a more spiritual relationship with God. And this is seen more in today's world, especially with not being able to go to church. But this is very important because when the people have something in common, they're going to start questioning, well, if the preachers are saying that I can have this spiritual relationship with God and, everyone else before this has said that you must be in church, well, what is really true and what is really not? And what this is going to make them do is they're going to start kind of not only questioning themselves, but they're going to start to question the church and the government, why are we listening to them, or why do we have to do things like this? And then what that's going to do is, why do we have to listen to England? And why do we have to follow the rules that England says? Well, how do we know this is the right thing? How do we know this isn't the right thing? And this is going to kind of get the wheels start turning in the brain, all right? Well, before we can get to the American Revolution, and I've kind of hit on this slide already, the American colonies function as independent, separate entities. There was no unity. Each had their own form of currency, democracy, economic interest. Great Awakening helps mold this. In other words, religious experience from all the colonies uniform. There's Christians in South Carolina who were culturally significant with something or with individuals that were practicing Christianity in New York, right? So fast five. So we'll talk about all of these. You go ahead and write this down on a separate sheet of paper and answer these as we kind of go. So before we can talk about the American Revolution, we have got to talk about the French and Indian War. All right, so the French and Indian War is a name for the North American theater. So when you hear the word theater, it just really means like setting or the arena in which the fighting is taking place for the imperial fight between England and France. So England and France are fighting against each other here in North America for not only control of the land, but the economic control that comes with the colonies in North America itself. So as a result of the close relations with the French via the fur trade, many Native Americans are going to side against the British. So that means they're going to be with the French fighting against the British, which I touched on in our last lecture. So really it's the French and the Indians versus Great Britain, and it should be really versus Great Britain and the colonists, right? So what's going to happen real quick is the British are going to win. Great Britain would end up being victorious in the Imperial battle with the French Native Americans. And the Treaty of Paris, a first little representation of the Treaty of Paris of 1763, is going to be signed, which formally ends the fighting in North America. And as a result, the French are going to lose majority of their claims to North American land. So what this does, really simplified here, guys, the French are going to be out of America for now. Okay, so the British are now going to dominate Eastern North America. So when you're looking at this area right here, all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River is going to be in control up through Canada by Great Britain. All right, now why is this area not controlled by Great Britain? Well, we haven't gotten there yet, but Spain owns it currently. All right, so they are going to be able to dominate this entire region. Because they can dominate this entire region, that means they have more involvement with the fur trade. That means they have more involvement with the raw materials that are going through this entire region, including lumber. They have more involvement with ports. So ideally, all this means is England is going to start to make a lot more money. Now, I told you we had lands all the way to the west of to the Mississippi River, but the problem is they are not going to want colonists to go out there. So it says, after French allies were defeated, Native Americans fought to keep an encroaching British forces from taking more land. The British called this uprising of Native Americans against the victorious British Pontiac Rebellion. But really what's important is the British are going to sign something called the Proclamation of 1763 with these Native Americans. This states that they would not settle lands that are west of the Appalachian Mountains. So if you're looking at this little map right here, all right, the Appalachian Mountains, which start in Georgia, Springer Mountain, and they're going to work their way all the way up to Maine, okay, what is at this time Massachusetts. Now, it's important that, you kind of understand this, because Native Americans are going to be on this side of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, not only do the British really want to, kind of limit the land that the Native Americans are on, but you got to kind of put yourself in this mindset. They just got out of fighting a war with France, right? So they're in debt. They don't really want to continue fighting. They don't really want to fight anymore. So what's going to happen is the colonists are going to say, hey, we fought this land, or fought for this land. We should be able to move west, right? They want more land. And England's going to say, no, you can't go past the proclamation line. Well, what's going to end up happening is the colonists are not going to follow this. And they're going to venture west, and they're going to have issues with Native Americans. And this, again, is another example of colonial resentment to new British laws. Okay, so when they specifically say, I'm not going to follow the proclamation line of 1763, this is them telling England, and England can kind of see it. Times are starting to change a little bit, and this is something that kind of opens their eyes. Now, I already kind of hit on this, but the financial aftermath of the war. So British are gonna amass a huge wartime debt from the fighting from the French around the world. Wanted stronger control over the colonial possessions. After all, they spent years fighting for it. And then it says, England thought, and this is huge, that the colonies should share the burden of paying for their defense. So even though the colonies did not ask them to protect them against the French, Great Britain is going to say, you know what, we protected you. This is your, this is your land. This is your area. You deserve to pay for it because we were coming to your defense. And it's kind of like, if you have a friend and they may ask you, hey, do you want Chick-fil-A? And you say, no, I'm good. And then they end up getting you Chick-fil-A and yeah, you owe me $5. And it's like, what? I told you I didn't want anything. And now you want me to pay for it. If you want to do it out of the kindness of your heart, that's one thing. But don't buy it from me when I told you no, then ask me to pay for it. And that's kind of what's going on. And says this belief entailed placing new unpopular taxes on the colonists without their approval. So I don't know how much you guys know about taxes, but taxes are placed on individuals to gather money, and they are doing this to pay for stuff, right? So the reason I have to pay an income tax or Social Security or anything like that is to pay for certain government programs, certain government projects and employees and stuff like that. So why are the colonists going to be upset? They have no choice, right? They have to pay it. And the reason that they have this battle cry of no taxation without representation is the fact that they do not have a representation in Parliament, meaning they cannot change the outcome even if they wanted to. And it's a big, and that's going to be the battle cry, no taxation without representation as you get closer to the American Revolution. This is a very important political cartoon almost, and it's join or die, meaning if a snake is in all one piece, it's pretty powerful. But when you start chopping up a snake, it is not as very powerful, and it's saying that when the colonists or the colonies are separate, they don't have any power. But when they're together, they're pretty strong. So the colonists respond to the taxes. So the Sugar Act is going to be the first act passed. It's going to be on sugar and molasses. The Stamp Act is going to be placed on anything paper, such as newspapers, license deeds, playing cards, literally anything. The Townsend Acts are going to be placed on glass and paint. Literally, when you think of town, think of like what it takes to build a town. And this is going to lead up to something known as the Boston Massacre. So as they keep passing these taxes, the colonists are going to get more and more fed up with these acts and with these taxes that are being passed. The Boston Massacre, which happens in March of 1770, is going to be in protest of taxes between colonists and British troops, and it's a little scuffle that kind of turns deadly, and it's a pretty interesting story. Real quick to tell you the story, what's going to happen is there's a bunch of people in Boston who just get out of a bar, and they're intoxicated, and they are trying to, I guess, have a good time. And what's happening in Boston during this time is the British are sending in troops. So the troops are kind of everywhere because they understand, like with the taxes, there's been more kind of rebelling, and they're just kind of making sure everybody's following and doing what they're supposed to be doing, trying to keep order within the city. Well, these individuals start throwing snowballs at these British soldiers, and then they decided it'd be a good idea to throw snowballs at them with rocks in them. Well, when this happens, a little scuffle breaks out, a shot goes off, and then you're going to have some individuals that are going to be shot and killed, and it's going to be a smaller number of individuals. It's not going to be a large number. It's 5 individuals that are going to be killed in the Boston Massacre, and this is important because it's going to spread like wildfire when people get a hold of this. They're going to see these drawings, and they're going to see that it looks like an attack on the colonists. Well, they use this as propaganda. This is like the first example of propaganda in United States history where when people look at this, and specifically this image that I got right here, when they look at this, it looks like, holy cow, like the army is lined up and they're just shooting people at will. This is not exactly what happened based on the story I just told you. But again, propaganda is not like that. There's a reason that we'll see it with the presidential election coming up, that both political candidates are going to put out propaganda. And it's kind of your job to figure out what's true and what's not. And a lot of people struggle with that. All right, so this is another one. This individual right here is very important. Crispus Attucks. He is going to be the first one that's going to die. He's actually a free man. He's a, just living in the city of Boston, and he is going to be the first one to die when it comes to that. And again, when people get word of this, that it's a massacre, it is going to spread like wildfire. So as the news spread about the massacre in Boston, colonists throughout the continent sprang into action, forming various organizations to resist British oppression. These 3 groups are very important. It's going to be the last thing I talk about today. The Sons of Liberty are going to be founded, and they're founded by Samuel Adams, and this is used to organize and implement tax protests. So these are the guys that are actually carrying out these tax protests, and some will talk about the Boston Tea Party. These are the individuals doing it. The next group is the Committee of Correspondence. These are like little shadow governments, and when you correspond with somebody, you're talking to them. So the Committee of Correspondence, their job is to keep constant communication between all of the colonies and make sure that, hey, if something is happening in Boston, that people in the rest of Massachusetts understand what's going on, or the people in Pennsylvania or wherever understand what's going on, and so that everybody can be on the same page. And the last thing I want to talk to you about is the Daughters of Liberty. The Daughters of Liberty are going to lead British boycotts lead boycotts of British cloth. They're going to try to make their own cloth. They're going to try to do anything possible to not rely on British goods because they want to limit the amount of money that the British are going to be making from this. And that's going to be where we're going to stop today. We will pick back up tomorrow with the Boston Tea Party and Thomas Paine's Common Sense.